in the interest of time and to keep everyone on pace. Thank you for those joining in person, and hopefully people will kind of stroll in here over the next couple minutes. And then for those obviously who watch it, welcome to tonight's webinar. This is a webinar we put on jointly with AMSSM and the ACGME to bring Dr. Laura Edgar in to speak with us and share our knowledge. Dr. Edgar is the Vice President for Milestone Development at the ACGME. She's been there since 2011. In her current role, she organizes and leads volunteers and staff members through the development of milestones and related material for all ACGME accredited specialties. She creates and manages the milestone resources that aid program directors, learners, and clinical competency committees. She serves as the liaison to the medical education community, and she frequently speaks on topics related to milestones, clinical competency committees, assessment, education, and accreditation. When not providing her expertise on effective assessment of learners, she enjoys spending time with her rescue pit bulls, Gus and Ernie. And so this is just for everyone, in case you didn't see it in the information. So this is part one of a two-part series. I think even if you joined just today and not the second part, I think you'll learn something. Obviously, kind of doing two parts would give you the most benefit. So today is an online session. And then the second part is actually one of the Faculty Development ICLs that will be on Sunday morning, where Dr. Edgar will be joining us in person to do some hands-on learning and assessment evaluation. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Dr. Edgar and she can get started. I will keep tabs of the chat to see if there's any questions. If things pop up, would you want me to save those for the end or kind of get them as we go along?
I think if they're timely, let's go ahead and cover them.
All right, perfect. So without further ado, Dr. Edgar, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. You know, Thursday nights can be a tough night, and so I appreciate that everybody has joined us. I am going to share my screen here. And here are my babies, Bernie and Gus. Bernie's the white one, Gus is the brown one. He's only a year and a half and he's already twice the size of my old dog. So yes, my fur children. But what I'm really here to talk to you tonight about is really thinking about your assessments, right? And thinking about little ways that you might be able to demonstrate some improvements without having to think about completely changing your program of assessment. As Rick said, this is going to be a two-part. Tonight, we're going to cover this information, and then at the in-person workshop, we're actually going to give you the opportunity to work on one of your own assessment tools if that is something that you want to do. So it's going to be a very hands-on opportunity. I have no disclosures. So the first thing we're going to cover are some basics about the principles of assessment, shared mental models, using your learners as active agents, and then finally faculty development. There's never enough faculty development, and that's true in assessment. So here's where we start. And this should look really familiar to everybody. Essentially, we've got the pyramid that's everything knows how, shows how, and does. And there are very specific types of assessments that you can use for each one. And, one of the really important things is, of course, making sure that you are using the right assessment tool at the right time. And one of the things that we have to remember is that almost all assessment that we do is really as part of direct observation. And so as we do this direct observation, whether it is you as faculty, or it is peer review, or it's even patients, getting this information is going to be really essential, and getting good information is essential to getting your program of assessment even started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of fit for purpose, right? So in other words, you have to figure out, again, whether or not it is going to be effectively assessing what it is that you're trying to measure, right? And is this tool that you're using going to help and provide feedback, right? And one of the things that we rarely want to do in a training program is to think about only summative assessments. We really want to make sure that we're thinking about the idea of assessment for learning so that they can keep growing and developing. And then finally, how does your assessment tool that you're using, how does it fit as part of your overall program of assessment? And you may or may not be surprised, but there is actually a formula that has been created. There's two versions of this. We're thinking about the combination of validity, reliability, acceptability, educational impact, and cost effectiveness. Cees van der Vleuten, when he created this utility index, it was really one of the first times that we really started to think about all of the individual elements that became part of our assessment tools. And I'm going to go through what each of these are. Some of them, I think but we'll just make sure we cover all of them. A second way to think about good assessment came from the consensus work for good assessment from the ICGME folks. So an international group that is thinking about how to do this good assessment. And you can see they came up with pretty similar ideas about what the various elements were. One big difference is probably this idea of the catalytic effect. But again, overall, we're looking at the same elements when we consider either model. So the first thing, of course, we want to think about is how well does it work, right? Reliability and validity. Just like you use and think about for your diagnostic testing, we have to think about for our assessment testing. We have to think about reproducibility. We have to think about the fact that if you have two faculty assessing the same activity, are they going to be able to come up with the same results? You would be surprised how often they don't. And some of that has to do with training about specific assessment tools. But again, as we think about these tools and the idea of shared mental models, which we're going to spend a few minutes on later on in this hour, those are two key elements that just get us started. Then we have to think about feasibility. Now, when we think about feasibility, I think that the two most important pieces of this are probably the fact that it's portable and that it's acceptable by your faculty and by your learners. By portable, I think one of the things that we probably all know, maybe we're just not sure how to do it all the time, is to develop an assessment tool that can be quick and can be done on the phone, right? So, you have an assessment tool and they can do it in a minute or two, and it can be done right then and right there. In terms of acceptance, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of assessment programs is a combination of either assessment tools that are too long, or they come too long after the experience ended or the rotation ended. Sometimes they're asking about things that weren't even part of that rotation. And so we have to make sure that we sort of come to this shared understanding about what these tools are supposed to look like for each step that we do. Then we have to think about the educational impact. And I mentioned this briefly before, right? We have the educational effect and the catalytic effect. So the educational effect is whether or not it motivates those who take it to prepare in a fashion that has educational benefit. And of course, the catalytic effect effect means it provides results and feedback that can support education. And again, this idea of this assessment for learning is really key in this idea of the catalytic effects. Well, then we have to think about our overall framework that we're going to use. And when you're thinking about especially your clinical competency committees, you know that you have a mix of data that is coming up to you. You have a combination of numbers, you have comments, and really all of this has to be analyzed and it has to be interpreted. Now, the thing that we expect from our clinical competency committees, of course, is that they're going to be actually reflecting on all of this information to really think about where it is and how it is that the learner is actually able to fit into, that milestones construct. And you're hearing all of this, and yeah, theory is great, right? But it really needs to be practical. And so what I just covered were some just really basic ideas and principles behind good assessment. But we have to make sure that what we're doing has a really good balance. Essentially, are you making the right decisions, right, about your learners? Do you have the data that you need to not only help your learners, but to help your program? And this is the crux of this work that we do. And I don't think there's anybody who thinks that assessment is easy. Assessment is actually quite difficult. There's a lot of training that can be involved. And if we were in person, I would be asking everybody, how many of you have ever actually been trained to use the assessment tools that you're using? We have this assumption that faculty just know how to do it. And yet there's never much of an opportunity to make sure that we're all starting and understanding the tool in the same ways. The other problem we run into is the idea of cognitive load. You are all, and your faculty are all extremely busy. You are working in very complex environments. And realistically, a lot of your faculty who maybe aren't core faculty, who maybe don't spend as much time with your fellows, they have this selective attention. They're worried about the day-to-day and not necessarily wanting to have to spend time thinking about actually assessing the work that was done. And so we have to make sure that when we're asking faculty to do this, that we're thinking about what is their overall balance, if you will, in terms of how much time they use for education versus how much time is in clinical practice. We know that many faculty, it's a very, very small percentage that is purely dedicated to education. And so we have to make sure that our assessment tools will work within that context. The other piece is really, if you have a long evaluation form, and especially for a short rotation, that's only going to lead to trouble. One of the things I highly recommend is to try to keep your assessment that you have, whatever you're sending out to your faculty, to be as few questions as possible. Anything that isn't necessary in a particular assessment, I would take it out. We know also that when we talk about assessment, that data for assessment tools is only accurate for about 2 weeks from the close of the experience. Anything that's completed more than 2 weeks after that, you're either going to have a tendency to be higher or lower. So you're either going to be a hawk, because you remember one bad experience, or you're going to tend to inflate those scores because you remember one really great experience. So if you have a long evaluation form, one of the things that can happen is people keep putting it off, right? And so then that just leads to the problem then of the fact that you're getting inaccurate data when they complete this assessment tool. So one of the ways to also think about this is that if you're using an assessment tool, you want to make sure that you have followed some sort of a checklist. You want to make sure you have all of the different elements as part of it. You know, if you can't go through each of your assessment tools that you have and go through this checklist to identify what each of these are for your assessment tool, you might need to go back and rethink about it. You know, is your tool formative or summative, right? What's the construct for your validity? Is, in other words, you know, what have you decided that this assessment tool actually means? Reviewing it with content experts, making sure folks are trained, and then piloting if it's something that you've created, and then of course implementing. Quite often, you might have to go back and forth on some of these things. The ideas of training your raters is something that should be done with some regularity, and in fact, probably need to have some level of retraining if they're not completing these forms very often. Now, I say this all the time. This is a slide I use repeatedly, and that is to remind you that the milestones are designed to be formative, right? The milestones are designed to be the receptacle of all of your other assessments. Now, I know that there are some people who use the milestones as their regular assessment tools, and I am here to urge you not to do that. There is not a rule that says you cannot do it. However, there are a lot of reasons that this becomes a problem. And a lot of them we've already talked about. You know, it's way too long. The cognitive load is incredibly high. But beyond that, there are things that are really important to be assessed that are not part of the milestones. And so if you are only using the milestones as your assessment tool, there are other important things that you are not collecting and you are probably not observing with any regularity. And so you want to make sure that you've got a really strong map in between your curriculum, the milestones, and all of your assessment tools, because your assessment really should be helping you with with both of those as you think about your overall program goals and objectives. So let's switch gears a little bit here. And we're going to talk about a shared mental model. This is something I personally spend a lot of time talking about. And it's really the idea that we are all going to create an idea. We're going to talk about something and make sure that we all have the same understanding. So let's start with this one, right? When you're looking at this assessment tool, I want you to spend 30 seconds or so thinking about what is wrong with this assessment tool. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds and then I'll come back. And feel free to put things in the chat if you've got some ideas. All right, very vague. Yes, very, very vague. All right, not specific questions. Yep, that's right. So one of the first things that we can think about on this one is that imagine you have two residents or fellows evaluated as borderline, right? What does that mean? Do you think that borderline is the same thing as the person that's in the office next to you? Is that the same thing as the other people that are, you know, in your faculty roster that are going to do some sort of evaluation? What about progressing? Right? Does progressing mean the same thing? Is progressing good, or is progressing like, they're moving forward, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're hitting the mark that you want them to meet? And by the way, this is a real evaluation form that somebody gave me to tell them what I thought of it. And they did agree that it was okay for me to use this. So no worries about that. But we have to make sure that when we're thinking about this, and in this case, of course, you don't have different PGYs, but if you thought about two fellows that were, maybe one had a lot of other experience in sports medicine and the other one didn't, would you expect them to look the same? Would you expect to be evaluating them both as the same levels? In the end, there's no standard here. There's no description about what each of these particular levels mean. So what I encourage all of you to do is to really think about how your assessment tools look in your program, to think about how it is that they're implemented in your program. Sit down with your faculty to look at your assessment tools. And if you've used something that's similar to this or any other tool, and talk about what each of those levels mean, that you are going to identify that somebody is progressing if, right? What is it that they're actually doing? This will take a little bit of time. This is not something that can be done in 5 minutes most of the time, because most of your assessment tools are not a single question like that. But by spending this time ahead, you're going to improve the consistency in which your faculty are actually creating their assessments. You're going to have that same understanding that in the milestones, a level 3 is a level 3 because, right? You're going to have that shared understanding ahead of time, and that saves a lot of time later on. Again, make sure everybody understands what it's measuring. Make sure they know how to measure and what to measure, right? Make sure that again, it's the same thing, that if you're doing a direct observation, that you're not looking at two different things. And make sure that it's been mapped to the goals of your program, right? Because if your assessment is not helping you, if it's not helping you meet one of your program goals, if it's not helping to meet the goals of your learners, then you're doing an assessment that isn't helping anybody. And so we want to make sure that we, again, remove any of this redundancy that we have that we don't necessarily need. So here's another example. I'm sure, hopefully none of you are using assessment tools that look like this right now, but I do know that some still exist. So let's spend about 30 seconds thinking about this one, and how might you improve this particular assessment tool? And go ahead and put it in the chat. Too many options. What does the number mean? Descriptors. Yep. "30 seconds goes really fast, doesn't it?" So what about this? I don't know if we have any musicians on here or not. What's really interesting about these 4 pieces of music right here is that it's actually all for the same song, but it's for different instruments. Okay, so what I'm basically trying to get at with this is that you have a group of people that have the same understanding about the song that they're trying to play, but they had to come up with a way that it worked within their context. And it's similar to what I'm hoping all of you will be able to do with your own assessment tools. Is it doesn't have to work for every program, whatever tool you come up with, but everybody has to make your tool within your institution work the same. Being in sports medicine, maybe you've seen some of these, especially if you work with kids. You got your smiley faces, you're almost theirs. With this one, at least you've got something that's a little bit more descriptive than just that number line, right? Of course, here, some of you might remember this, right? That's very similar to just having that old Likert scale of 1 to 9. But this one is actually really easy to improve, right? First of all, we can shrink the numbers, right? That was something that somebody pointed out, was that there were too many numbers and we didn't know what they meant, and descriptors for each level or group. When you have these types of descriptors, it just automatically makes it a lot easier to be able for everybody to identify what it is that they're assessing, to identify whether or not that they've done it. You might still need to spend a little bit of time getting into the details of it. But again, this is at least going to give you a really big head start in helping to, again, improve your assessment tools and improve the use of your assessment tools. So here is another example. Now, this is not from your specialty. This was taken from a different specialty, but this is another one to think about. Now, this is applied knowledge of the biology and physiology of aging to promote healthy aging. Now, what is it that's being evaluated in this particular statement, right? You know, if you really think about this, so first of all, you know, you've got the applies knowledge, you've got the biology and physiology, and you've got healthy aging. But what does that actually look like? This is something that if we were all sitting together, I would have you at your tables talking about what this definition is. What does this, how would you measure this, right? What is it that it's looking for? By having that conversation, again, it doesn't take very long for a single statement like this, but these are the types of things that I want you to think about when you're thinking about how you're going to create that shared mental model around your assessment tools. So I'm going to switch again. You know, I don't want to bore you too much with all just straight assessment. It can get a little repetitive. But now we're going to talk about using your learners as active agents. One of the things that I think many programs don't take enough advantage of is their learners in terms of how they can be useful in your program of assessment. If you were to sit down and really go through all of your different assessment tools, your milestones, the different ways that you evaluate them at the beginning of the program, right? One of the things that does is it opens up a level of transparency. They understand what your program of assessment is. They can then use all of those assessment data points that you give to them for creating their own individualized learning plans, which, in case you're not aware, that is a program requirement. All of your learners do have to have that individualized learning plan. What you want to think about, and although normally I talk about this in terms of milestones, I think this can be done with other assessments as well, where you can ask your learners to create their own self-assessment. You can ask your learner, have your learners ask for assessment. Obviously, there's a time and a place to have assessments done, but you can allow your learners to take the lead on that. Just because you have an end of rotation assessment doesn't mean you can't have a mid-rotation assessment or some sort of weekly assessment that can step in and give more information. You know, by asking your learners to take some of that control, it's going to ease up that burden a little bit on especially the program director and the program coordinator who's constantly trying to get these evaluations from the faculty. It's also going to be able to provide more real-time feedback in the moment. So again, it's going to be more helpful for learning when your learners are engaged in all of this. The other good piece to this, which I don't have on the slide, is the fact that a lot of your learners, especially when you get to about probably mid-year in most programs, they know who's doing assessment. They know who's not doing good assessment. They probably have some insight into some of this work that you're going to be doing. They know which assessment tools do not help them. And so one of the things that you can do is, especially as you are thinking about your end of year work that you're going to be doing with them, is sitting them down and having them go through the various assessment tools and let them tell you what they were able to learn from the information that was provided from it. Talk to your program evaluation committee. How much of the data from all the assessment tools was actually useful to them when they were thinking about how to improve your program, right? Again, if you're not finding value from these different assessment tools, I want you to question why you're using that assessment tool. So faculty development. There's never enough faculty development. There's also never enough time for faculty development. So we're going to talk about a couple of different things that we can do for faculty development, again, to help get to this idea of creating shared mental models, because this is our ultimate goal with this, is to have each program spend the time to do this work. You have to go back and do training. If you have never sat down with your faculty to go through your different assessment tools, you have to take a step back and you have to do that training, because those tools are only as good as the person using them. And if they don't have that information, again, they're doing the best they can, but it doesn't mean it's the best work. You need to make sure that the faculty is comfortable making those decisions with the tools that you have, right? Make sure that they understand that what the purpose of that tool is, and that they feel like the judgment that they're making with that tool is something that is going to be impactful for the learner, but that it's also something that they feel like they're in the right position to make that call for whatever activity it is. There are a lot of different ways to think about how to do faculty development. And one of the things that I recommend is doing both formal and informal training for all of this. Include your fellows. Many of your fellows are going to go into academic medicine. And so why not start teaching them how to do these things as well? Plus, they might be doing assessments of other learners that are there with them. So if they can start to learn good principles of assessment while they're with you, it just gets them a step ahead for when they go off to their next job. Now, with the formal, everybody knows there's a program requirement. You have to have a certain amount of faculty development every year that's related to something about accreditation or education. But it's the informal ones that I think that can actually be just as powerful, just as powerful to be able to make big changes. And although I say formal and informal, the other way to think about this is sort of macro and micro learning. Macro learning is going to be the big, retreat or the faculty development seminar, having them watch this session later on. But the micro learning can be just as powerful. And with micro learning, what I recommend you do is, if you have a monthly department meeting, allow 10 minutes each month or 15 minutes at each of those meetings to be about faculty development. Talk about a single assessment tool during that 10 minutes. Micro learning can be something that if they get a little bit every month, then the sum total is they're going to get a lot more than if they sat through, maybe a 1 hour faculty development workshop where they kept getting paged out of the room, right? Where in this way, what they're able to do is they're able to get that 10 minutes as part of another meeting that is already blocking other things on their calendars. So if you can do it that way, again, it's an easy way to get it in, and they don't necessarily think about it as faculty development, but there's no reason that you can't call it faculty development. So I'm just going to try to put this all together in just a couple of statements for you to really think about. Remember that for any assessments that you're going to be working on, you want to be clear about the purpose. It has to provide meaning to the faculty and the learner. It has to provide meaning to the clinical competency committee, right? It's something that we know that they're going to have to use this data as well. Make sure that your assessments, your program of assessment is looking at each of the 6 core competencies. You know, it's not always easy to do, which is why I really suggest mapping all of those things together, your curriculum, your milestones, and as well as your assessments. And the way that you're going to end up doing the assessment is through direct observation with purposeful assessment, again, because you've gone through and you've thought about each of these things. I'm not suggesting that you throw everything away and start over, right? Capture what you're already doing and just figure out ways that you can make some improvements. What we talked about today are improvements in action, so to speak. And then at the in-person seminar, we're going to talk about actual improvements to the tool. So things that we can maybe do that are going to help make the assessment tool that you're using a little bit better. Work together, which is, you know, what this workshop is, this webinar is doing, and what that workshop will do next month, or I'm sorry, in May. And again, this way, all of these tools are gonna, if you work together, you could actually create, and I don't know if this is something you've ever thought about or not, but you can create a toolbox that is housed by your program director group, where essentially people identify, and if in your program you identify an assessment tool that you think works really, really well, create a repository where all of you can put those different types of things. One program may have a great tool for one particular experience, and somebody else has other tools for other experiences. And it's a good way for you to be able to help each other. We sometimes forget that we don't have to work in isolation, you know, that we actually have a rather large community around us, and we can, in fact, work together. Remember that it's a process, right? You want to do your best to get some help so that you can find the time to do this work to create a shared mental model, that you've got good feasibility, you've got good quality, and you have good attitudes around it. Because again, that's another piece that can really derail any program of assessment. If nobody likes doing it and nobody likes getting the results, then it's probably not helping anybody. So I'm hoping that what this is doing today is going to help you to start thinking about how you're going to be able to improve your assessment tools, how it is that you're going to be able to start improving your program of assessment, right? And then again, at that next meeting, we'll be able to do a whole lot more. Now, I'm going to open it up for questions. And I've got a couple of resources that I do want to show you very quickly, though. One is my contact information. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to talk to me or my team. If we don't know the answer, we probably know who to send you to. And then also, there are a couple of pieces that I want to point out. One, we do have an assessment guidebook on our website, along with a lot of other guidebooks like Clinical Competency Committee Guidebook, Milestones Guidebook, Implementation Guidebook. So there's this one. And then also in April of 21, there was a supplement issued from JGME, which is an open access journal, in case you're not aware. And this particular supplement was all about milestones, assessment, clinical competency committees. And it is something that there's an article in there specifically on shared mental models. And there are multiple articles in here on assessment as well, including assessment of each of the four competencies that most of you struggle with, which are systems-based practice, professionalism, communications, and practice-based learning. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I am happy to answer any questions.
While people are thinking of it, I do have one. One question, one statement. The statement is, we actually do have a program director toolbox, because I created that several years ago. It is in need of massive updating, given we've had new program requirements, the new milestones, and so more to come for the group at our fellowship committee, because I'm going to try to figure out to find some volunteers to help with that. So, and then I noticed, you showed a couple different examples of those assessment tools, right? And as it evolved and we found one, like we saw an example of what was maybe a good one or a better one, that looked awfully similar to the wording of like a milestone, right? We're not supposed to use the milestone, but then we have a bunch of specific ones that look like that. Like, how do we, make that so that that evaluation tool doesn't get like humongous? Yeah.
So what I would do is, again, focus on the particular rotation that you're assessing for. If there is only one subcompetency that works for it, if you want to pull out pieces of it, I think that that's okay to do. I just don't recommend using the wholesale. And I have seen programs that do it, that they literally send the entire milestones document to their faculty to complete for each rotation. But I think it's okay to use some of the language from it. There's a lot of different ways to think about your assessment tools. And I can tell you that I think some of the best assessment tools are just a couple of questions long. And it's really more about the comments than about any ranking or rating that you do. And if your faculty can be sort of brought around to the idea of writing good comments, those are a lot more helpful to your learners. They're a lot more helpful to your clinical competency committee. And, in the long run, I think that it actually provides a lot more information.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? We have the availability with a smaller kind of room and numbers that you could just open up your mic and ask away. If you want to type it in the chat, I can read it. Hopefully, I thought that was an excellent presentation. I think it's information that is useful. I've sat in residency, clinical competency, and I'm just in our faculty meetings and wondering why we are reviewing this a tool. And so, like, I'm in the process of trying to renovate one, redo one for our residents in family medicine that is specifically done by our clinical staff. So our MAs, our RN that works in our office. So because it wasn't giving useful information. Like every single month we would go, yep, that's unhelpful. And so I'm trying to do that. So I'm definitely going to use that checklist that you had. All right, we had a question. Any ideas on how to facilitate faculty development for our orthopedic colleagues?
I feel like that's a tainted question. I think it can actually be the same way. It's one of the things that we have tried to do is to really instill this idea with all of our specialties, including orthopedics. We've actually done a lot of work with them about how to start thinking about assessment. And one of the things that I understand from my orthopedics colleagues is really they much prefer those in the moment assessments than they do sort of like sending them an assessment 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later. They would much rather do an you say, hey, on Wednesday, I need you to do an assessment of this fellow. and they seem to be more likely to do it. And some of that, I think, again, it's sitting down and having the conversation. I need you to assess these fellows on these topics. Let's talk about what's going to work best for you. Sometimes it's that direct is the best way to get at it. But yes, I hear that frequently, even from my orthopedics colleagues, that sometimes are hard to tackle.
Excellent. Yeah. We start like our resident, like family medicine residencies works easier. There's many more rotations, obviously. They start sending out the evaluations for the month at the mid-month mark, so that you can start looking at them to, potentially refresh your memory. So instead of sending them out after or 2 weeks later, we get them during the month, which I think is kind of helpful, especially if I'm on service in the hospital and I've already done my week, instead of having to wait to the end of the month to get the evaluation tool. It's certainly helpful. Anyone else have additional questions? I know you're all out there. I see some of your pictures, and I know most of the group.
So Rick,
Yes.
I would like to add, I think doing those mid-month send outs are really nice, because the other part is it also adds in a little bit of the reminder to do a little bit of a mid-month feedback with those learners. I mean, when you have them with you for a month, you get the assessment 2 weeks after they're done. They can't make the improvements that you'd like to see in that second half of that rotation. And so getting the initial reminder that you need to do a end of the session review with them, an evaluation, then it also prompts that mid-month evaluation as well, which is a little bit less formal, but at the same time, probably twice as effective and needed.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that I actually like are, different programs have different names for them, but, like Feedback Friday, where every Friday you sit down with whoever you're working with to say, hey, here's what you're doing really well, and here's what I want you to work on for next week. You're going to get so much more out of them by using that, by being direct and giving them that early feedback. So even if you only do it mid and then at the end, but I love the idea of, like I said, the Feedback Fridays. It's a great way to keep everybody on track. And if you know that somebody's struggling, you're letting them know at the beginning, hey, you're struggling and I need you to step it up, without it having to become a problem.
Absolutely. All right. Anyone else? Again, so for those on live, and then for those watching, that second part, so the hands-on portion of this two-part series will be at the Faculty Development ICL on Sunday morning. So that is, I believe that is April 30th. And we timed this to be 1 month ahead. There may or may not be data that support these two sessions being right about 3 to 4 weeks apart, as optimal. And so anyone who's here and wants to come to that, that's great. If you want to make your faculty or your program director watch this video, that would be great, just to try to increase the competency of us as evaluators, right? To be able to evaluate meaningful our learners, our fellows. Any other questions before we say goodbye to Dr. Edgar for now? And then definitely happy that she's going to join us in Phoenix at the end of April. Oh, let's see.
I just put 2 links in the chat. One is for that ACGME supplement, and the other one is for the assessment guidebook.
Okay. And then Andy had put a reminder from AMSSM about when the online pre-registration closes. So just for those who have not registered yet, get on that and come to the meeting in Phoenix. All right, again, thank you very much, Dr. Edgar, for your time this evening. Definitely I enjoyed it, and I'm hopeful those who watch will as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.